Hello, and welcome to this podcast, to Tim the Composer's podcast. I'm Tim, and I'm a composer. This is episode 0, so I'm going to introduce myself to you and introduce this podcast, who I am, what it's all about. At least, what I intend this podcast to be all about. Perhaps you'll be listening far in the future, and this podcast will have become something else. But in episode 0, I will explain what I plan to do right now. Who am I then? You can call me Tim the Composer, but my real name is Tim Benjamin. I'm a composer, yes, a real composer. I write music, what you might call classical music. That's music for classical instruments like violins and pianos and orchestras. But it's more than that. There's a problem with this word, classical. It's music in a certain tradition. Now, this is the heart of what this podcast is all about. There's a tradition that's more or less 1,000 years old. It started somewhere in Europe, and it's bound up with the idea of Western civilization. Other civilizations are available, but this Western one, which has its roots in the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, but is particular to a reawakening centuries after the last centurion laid down his tufty helmet. After the fall of Rome, Europe entered what's called the Dark Ages, but they weren't particularly dark. Lots of interesting and exciting things happened. But about 1000 AD, things started to change in radical and exciting ways, in technology, in changing social ideas, and in the shared culture of this part of civilization, of human civilization, indeed in the idea of what our civilization actually is. We began, slowly at first, to question the absolute right of kings, the rule of kings, and the occasional queen, to question the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and enter into what's called the Enlightenment. The intellectual and artistic lights began to turn on, and soon after that, the literal lights began to turn on too. And after 9 or 10 centuries, Europe and the West, which included America and other parts of the world, even more distant from Europe than America, began to look much like something we could recognize today. There were nations, for a start, and the rise of nations was a very important influence on the emergence of our Western culture. There was an explosion of artistic and technological energy that continues to this very day. A big part of that artistic explosion is the tradition of what is called classical music. It's sometimes even called Western classical music, but today it's a global tradition. It just began in Western Europe and spread, like many things, from there. But there is a problem with this word classical. That was invented and attached to this musical tradition quite recently, in the 19th century. As part of the emergence of nations, there was a cultural need to define national identity in relation to something that had gone before, to establish great works of great ancestors. And so the classics were identified, idealized examples of great composers and great works, and a classical story or tradition was created. So I don't really like this word, classical, as it only applies, and only in hindsight, to quite a short part, quite a small part of this tradition that's much bigger than the relatively modern history of nations and national identity. This tradition, the real tradition, goes back a lot further into the mists of time. And much of it is lost to us thanks to war, the movement of people, the rise and fall of cultures, countries, empires, advances in technology. But nonetheless, it is there. It really exists, a continuous cultural chain all the way back for 1,000 years. It began 1,000 years ago when someone decided that music could be remembered by writing it down. And when they figured out a reliable way to write it down that someone else could read and could also understand, that's when it all started. When they did that, the music was able to last longer than they did. And the next lot of people that came along were able to build upon it with their own ideas. What's more, people were able to take those ideas to different places, to spread them to anyone else who could read what was written down. Writing it down then allowed it to gradually become more complex, and for the ideas that were embodied in the written down music to become bigger, more ambitious, to express things. The artistic vision of each contributor to this drew upon the artistic vision of the previous contributor. Ideas were spread slowly at first, and the music was at first mainly just for voices to sing. But new technology came along. New technology helped both new forms of communication, the printing press, for example, and later on the radio and recordings. And new kinds of instrument emerged and were improved upon. And new music was written down for the new capabilities of these new instruments that today we think of as old. And the people and stories involved in all of this are extraordinary. They're fascinating. The composers in particular, of course, I would say that, who are driving forward this whole thing by reading what had been done before by other composers and writing new music down. The characters we meet across these 1,000 years and the music they created, well, they're as varied as you might think over that expanse of time. Sometimes they were hilarious. Sometimes you can really relate to them. Sometimes they're crazy, brilliant geniuses and you struggle to understand really what they were about. Sometimes they were unpleasant. Sometimes, actually quite often, the circumstances in which they lived were difficult, to say the least. The struggles they faced to fulfill the urge to create music and to write it down, sometimes when they weren't even allowed to. But here we are, despite everything, 1,000 years on, and this tradition still exists, and it's still going strong. There are still composers, I'm one of them, playing my very small part in this grand tradition. So what do we call it then, if not classical music? What connects it, in a more or less unbroken chain, is that it's written down, so we could call it literate music. That's not to say, sort of rudely, that other musical traditions that aren't normally or primarily written down, such as folk music, pop music, jazz music, it's not to call them illiterate in some kind of dismissive way. But they are non-literate, that's not the way they work. They work and evolve in a very different way, through different mediums. So yes, other kinds of great and wonderful music also exist. These are often influenced by this tradition, this 1,000-year tradition of literate music. But they themselves are perhaps not part of this tradition that is the subject of this podcast. Hope that's clear. Anyway, this music is complex, it's rich, it's extreme, it's beautiful, it's terrifying sometimes, it's mind-expanding. When people play it, they have to devote their whole brain and their whole heart to it at the same time, and it has a complexity and a richness that endlessly rewards repeated listening, repeated performing. Now, it can be like this because it's written down. Of course, that means we have to read music while we play, and it's quite difficult and rare to memorize everything, especially when we're in an orchestra or another group of performers. But I think people are missing out. Maybe you are missing out, and I don't want you to miss out. You're part of this 1,000-year thing. Now, I heard that most people have no idea of the name of their great-grandparents. Can you name your great-grandparents? What about your great-great-grandparents? Most people can't. Now, people can remember their grandparents most often, but names beyond that seem to disappear from our memory around about the great-grandparent mark. So grandparents, your grandparents, that's maybe 50 to 100 years ago since they were born, depending on how old you are. Great-grandparents add another 20 to 50 years perhaps at a real stretch. But here we are talking about things that people who lived and breathed hundreds of years ago, things that they did, which influenced in the most fundamental way the music that you can listen to right now. What's this podcast then? It's going to explore this 1,000-year tradition of music. It's going to explore the music itself, what it is, how to listen to it, how to get the most from it, how to understand what it's trying to tell you. That's one of the most, I think, incredible things about this tradition. It's a way to understand the mind of a composer from centuries ago in a way that really nothing else can. Not drawing, not writing. This music tells you what that composer was really feeling and brings it immediately to life in a way that reading words on a page or looking at a painted image, I don't think they can. And that's because it deals with change over time, different kinds of time. Imagine singing happy birthday to someone, and you could compare that to writing down the words happy birthday in a card, for example. Singing the words holds much richer meaning, and you could even change the way you sing those words to add layers to the meaning. You could sing it sarcastically, for example. And have you noticed that it takes a lot longer to sing someone happy birthday than just simply saying those words? So it's a ritual, it's emotion, it's saying, I really mean this. It's a celebration of one more year. And when there are no more years left, remembering it is so infinitely more powerful in meaning than almost anything else, because it plays with time. So this music, this tradition of music is like that, but times a million or billion and in many more dimensions. And wouldn't it be great to explore that? Why me then? Why am I the one who's going to accompany you on this journey? Well, I'm a composer, and this music is written by composers. It's composers who are speaking to us over these centuries, this 1,000 years. There have been many, many great performers too who have brought this music to life. But it's composers who have looked at the work of previous composers and thought, I can do that. I can add something. I can do it better. I have something else to say. This is the particular way I choose to say what I have to say. And I'm going to use this written down language that composers who have gone before me have also used. I'm going to use their ideas and build upon them, or attack them, or draw contrasting ideas from them, or try and refuse to be influenced by them, but even in so doing, I'm defining what I have to say in relation to them. Well, I hope that I've got a particular vantage point on this music. I want to tell you something interesting about the music itself, to introduce you to it, to open your ears to a new universe from my perspective as a composer. So this isn't a history podcast. I'm not a historian, but I'm a composer, and I want to let you into the mind of these other composers from over 1,000 years. What do I think they were thinking when they created this music? What was going on in their lives at the time? What were they trying to say? What were they trying to prove? Why did they write music? How are they connected to this tradition, to other composers? How did they take this art, this culture forward or backward? What did they leave for those who followed? How did they influence other composers across centuries? Why did they do it the way they did? So these are the stories of the composers and their music, their innermost ideas, their feelings, their love, their anger, their desire for change in the world, their thoughts about life after death, about human life and the human spirit, about those who ruled over them, sometimes tyrants, sometimes generous beyond belief. It's what they felt about God, about the devil. It's the expression in music of what they could see and hear hundreds of years ago, yet as fresh as if it's right there in front of you. It's about the expression of things they could not possibly say out loud. The expression of generations of composers, each building upon the last. And sometimes it's even just the story of how they did what they did for money. And there have always been easier ways to make money than to write music. So the stories, believe me, they're worth hearing. And so is the music. So this podcast is going to try and tell you the 1,000-year story of this music from my perspective as a composer. Every episode will explore a single piece of music, and I'll tell you the story of that music, of the composer who wrote it, try and understand why they did what they did at that moment in time. I hope you find it interesting, naturally, but what I really hope is that you'll be inspired to go and listen to this music, to explore it for yourself, and learn what to listen for, how to listen to it, how to spot the connections across time, how the tradition is built up on itself, and above all, to understand what on earth these crazy people, these composers, were trying to say to you. So go and listen to episode 1, and I'll see you there. So I'm Tim the Composer. This is my podcast. Bye for now.